By sunrise on March 30th, 1979, many families near 3 Mile Island had stopped asking what the perfect answer was. They were asking what the least dangerous answer was. A radio sat on the kitchen table. Coffee had gone cold. A mother folded small shirts into a bag. A father stood by the car with the engine off, waiting for one more update before deciding whether to leave. The voices on the radio still did not sound simple. The language was careful, technical, measured. But fear does not stay measured for long when the danger is invisible. By then, the state had advised pregnant women and preschool children within 5 miles of the plant to leave. That sentence changed the shape of the crisis. It entered bedrooms, nurseries, and school hallways. People were not looking at smoke over the river. They were looking at children. Some parents packed fast. Some waited for one more bulletin. Some said they would leave only if the next report sounded worse. Some did not trust the reports anymore. The accident had already gone far beyond the island. It was now in family arguments, whispered phone calls, and the slow line of cars leaving home. This is the true story of 3 Mile Island, and it is also the story of something less visible than radiation. It is the story of how public trust can fail, not all at once, not with one speech, but through hours of uncertainty, partial truth, and voices that sound too careful for the fear people are feeling in their own bodies. Chapter 1. The Island in the River. 3 Mile Island lay in the Susquehanna River near Middletown, Pennsylvania. Harrisburg, the state capital, was close enough that any serious trouble there could become a state and national story in hours. In the 1970s, nuclear energy stood inside a larger American dream. The country had built suburbs, highways, airports, giant factories, and rockets. Many people saw nuclear energy as another sign that modern systems could deliver abundance through discipline and expertise. It was supposed to be smart power, power managed by trained people, thick manuals, serious equipment, and careful rules. This optimism had a political side, too. The United States had faced energy anxiety in the 1970s. Oil shocks had shaken public life. Lines at gas stations had shown how vulnerable modern comfort could be. In that climate, nuclear power could look like stability. It could look like independence. It could look like an answer to an uncertain future. That did not mean ordinary families thought about reactor design over dinner. Most did not. They thought about school, shifts, rent, weather, and the price of gas. The plant was simply part of the local horizon. It stood there like many large institutions stand in modern life, quietly, heavily, asking for trust. 3 Mile Island had 2 reactor units. The accident would happen at Unit 2. From the outside, the station suggested control: concrete buildings, pipework, security fences, rooms full of instruments. It looked like the kind of place where nothing was left to chance. That appearance matters when we tell the story, because what broke in March 1979 was larger than a machine part. A public promise broke too, the promise that complexity itself meant safety, the promise that if danger ever came, experts would understand it faster than fear could spread. Many people around the plant had given that promise no dramatic thought. That is how trust often works. It lives quietly in normal days. It becomes visible only when it fails. On the morning before the accident, local life still moved in ordinary patterns. Night workers were near the end of their shift. Mothers and fathers were asleep in nearby towns. Children would soon need breakfast and school clothes. The river moved in darkness around the island as if nothing unusual could happen there. But inside Unit 2, the system was about to enter one of the most famous accidents in American industrial history. Chapter 2. Before Dawn at Unit 2. The accident began before most people around the plant were awake. At about 4 o'clock in the morning on March 28, 1979, water that should have helped carry heat away stopped moving in the normal way at Unit 2. The trouble began in the part of the plant outside the core itself, but that part still mattered deeply. Without that flow of water, the station could not remove heat the way it was supposed to. The turbine shut down. Then the reactor shut down automatically, too. That automatic response sounds reassuring, and it partly was. The machine had sensed abnormal conditions and acted, but shutdown did not remove the danger. A reactor that has just shut down is still very hot. Heat does not vanish because a switch has moved. Pressure rose inside the main reactor system. A safety valve opened to bring that pressure down. Then came the deadly turn. The valve did not shut when it should have. It stayed open. Water that should have stayed in the system kept escaping. Inside the control room, operators were facing a dangerous event that was both real and misleading. One instrument made it look as if that valve had closed, but the reactor itself was living another reality. Water was leaving, heat was staying. The machine and the operators were no longer living inside the same picture. That mismatch would define the next hours. The accident at 3 Mile Island did not begin with one giant dramatic image. It began with hidden loss of cooling, a stuck valve, and a false signal. That is one reason it matters so much. It showed how a modern disaster can grow quietly inside a system that still looks, at first glance, as if it is following procedure. Even now, that part of the story feels cold. A valve, a reading, a delay. Nothing cinematic, yet those simple things created a path toward a partial meltdown. That is also why listeners need to resist one easy mistake. 3 Mile Island was not merely a story about a machine that failed. It was a story about a machine that failed in a way people could misunderstand while trying to save it. The danger grew not only from metal and water, but from interpretation. In those first hours, the reactor was already becoming a test of human judgment. Chapter 3. The Room of Wrong Signals. People sometimes imagine industrial disasters as one big human mistake. 3 Mile Island was more cruel than that. It was a chain of decisions made under a false picture. The control room was crowded with alarms. Lights flashed, buzzers and warning sounds competed for attention. Meters and displays were active everywhere. The operators had information, but they did not have a clear picture. That is not the same thing. They believed there was too much water in one part of the system. They worried that the plant could become dangerous in that direction. Emergency cooling had started, but operators reduced some of that cooling. Later, after strong vibration, major pumps were turned off. Inside the world they thought they were seeing, these choices had logic. Inside the reactor's real condition, they were disastrous. Water kept escaping. Parts of the core were no longer fully covered. Heat rose sharply. Fuel was damaged. The core partially melted. No siren outside the plant could tell the public exactly what those words meant at that moment, and that is part of what made the event so frightening. The worst damage was hidden. The operators were trying to read a problem they could not fully see. The public would soon fear a problem it could not see at all. It is worth staying inside that room for one more beat. The men there were not trying to be reckless. They were trying to make decisions fast while the system shouted at them from every side. That human pressure belongs in the story. 3 Mile Island was not only a machine failure, it was also a failure of human beings to understand a machine quickly enough under stress. The room itself was part of the accident. There were too many alarms, too many signals, too many ways for a trained operator to feel busy without seeing the whole truth. Later investigations would look closely at that world of panels, sounds, and display design. But in the moment, nobody in that room had the comfort of later knowledge. They had minutes, pressure, noise, and a reactor slipping away from them. Later, many discussions of the accident would focus on design, training, and procedure. They were right to do that, but in the live moment, none of those later lessons had arrived yet. There were only exhausted human beings trying to make sense of conflicting signs before the reactor's condition became worse. The room full of alarms was not only a workplace. For a few hours, it was the narrow center of a crisis that would soon spread across the whole country. Chapter 4. The story leaves the plant. At first, people outside the station did not hear one clear story. They heard fragments, a reactor problem, an incident, a release, no immediate danger, possible concern, radiation. When news arrives in fragments, each person starts building the missing parts alone. That is when fear grows fastest. In the communities around the plant, the day still had its ordinary shape. Children needed breakfast. Men and women went to work. Phones rang. Neighbors talked over fences and across driveways. But the accident entered those ordinary spaces very quickly. Some residents trusted the calmest official statements. Some listened for what those statements were not saying. Some decided that every delay in plain language was its own warning. People kept radios on in kitchens for hours. Television sets stayed on in living rooms. At offices and store counters, conversations kept returning to the same questions. How bad is it? How far could danger travel? If the plant says not to panic, should that make people calm or suspicious? Invisible danger does something special to the mind. A fire can be seen. Floodwater can be seen. But radiation lives inside trust. People depend on experts to say where it is, how much of it exists, and what should happen next. If those explanations sound late, technical, or uncertain, fear moves in quickly. This is where 3 Mile Island began to change from an industrial accident into a national emotional event. The trouble was no longer only in pipes and valves. It was now in language, in timing, in whether public words felt strong enough to carry invisible risk. A family listening in a kitchen could not inspect the reactor. A teacher deciding whether to keep children in class could not inspect the reactor. A shop owner, bus driver, nurse, or police officer could not inspect the reactor. All of them had to act through information given by others. That dependency made every public sentence heavier than usual. It also changed the rhythm of local time. Instead of one normal day following another, people began to live by update. The next bulletin, the next radio report, the next statement from the governor, the next rumor from a friend who said someone inside the plant had heard worse news. That waiting is part of the historical feeling of 3 Mile Island. The crisis was not only danger, it was delay. And delay under fear can feel almost physical. Chapter 5: Kitchens, School Buses, and the Road Out. By March 29th and March 30th, the accident had become a public crisis, not only a plant crisis. The reactor mattered, but so did every family trying to decide what caution meant. Not everybody ran. That point matters. Some residents stayed calm. Some watched and waited. Some left for a day. Some sent children away but stayed behind themselves. Some refused to move because they did not believe the danger was severe. But beneath all those choices was one shared condition. Ordinary people were being forced to make personal decisions before they felt sure the system above them was sure. By March 30th, Governor Richard Thornburgh advised pregnant women and preschool children within 5 miles of the plant to leave temporarily. That was not a full evacuation order, but emotionally it hit much harder than a technical bulletin. Once unborn babies and very young children were named, the crisis entered the body. It entered the imagination of mothers. It entered the fear of grandparents. It entered the silence between 2 parents standing over a half-packed bag. Children may not have understood all the words adults used, but they understood changed faces. They understood schools closing early. They understood unusual rides in cars. They understood that adults were listening hard and speaking softly. School buses were part of the atmosphere too. Some routes changed, some school plans shifted, some children were picked up early. Every small break in routine told the same story. Normal life was no longer normal. Roads around the region became scenes of uncertainty. Cars pulled away not because people knew exactly what was coming, but because they could no longer accept not knowing. That is an important difference. Mass fear does not always come from certainty of disaster. Sometimes it comes from uncertainty combined with responsibility. If you are only protecting yourself, you may wait. If you are protecting a child, you may leave sooner. That is why the governor's carefully limited advisory still had such power. Even people outside the 5-mile area heard it as a moral signal. If the youngest should go, then the danger had crossed from engineering into family life. Once that happens, fear no longer belongs only to experts. It belongs to everyone. There is another reason this stage matters so much. The advisory did not come after the public had received one clean, confident explanation of the danger. It came after days of shifting trust. That meant the message landed in a landscape already worn down by uncertainty. The words were official, but the emotional effect was deeply personal. A mother did not hear only a policy choice. She heard the state saying that caution now belonged in her own hands. Hospitals, police departments, schools, and local offices all had to make their own practical choices while public language was still settling. Should workers go home? Should schools keep children inside or release them early? Should a family trust the map of miles around the plant or trust the older feeling that invisible danger might move farther than officials believed? Those questions turned the accident into a test of daily judgment. Even simple tasks felt different. Buying milk felt different. Sending a child to school felt different. Driving across a bridge felt different. The landscape had not changed much to the eye, but the meaning of the landscape had changed. That is one reason the fear was so hard to carry. The world still looked normal, while families wondered whether normal was safe. That split between appearance and fear became one of the deepest memories the accident left behind. Chapter 6. Carter visits, but trust stays shaken. Once the accident became a national story, federal power had to appear in public. President Jimmy Carter came to Pennsylvania during the crisis. His visit carried unusual weight. He had studied nuclear technology during his naval career. He understood enough to know the public meaning of presence. A president showing up at a nuclear emergency says something simple. The government is not hiding. The government is not fleeing. That helped calm some people, but calm is not the same thing as restored trust. By then, the country had already watched a highly trained system edge toward catastrophe through wrong signals, unclear understanding, and decisions that made sense only inside a false picture. That realization stayed. Even people who still supported nuclear power now had a harder memory attached to it. The accident had shown something deeply modern and deeply unsettling. A system can look strong from far away and still become dangerous through confusion at the center. And once the public sees that, it cannot easily return to the old tone of confidence. Carter's visit also mattered because it offered a human image against spreading abstraction. The crisis had become full of technical terms: valve, core, pressure, release. But people do not emotionally live inside terms like that. They live inside faces. A governor speaking carefully, a president arriving in person, a family still unsure whether to unpack the car. Those images carried the crisis into public memory. The visit did not erase fear. It did not suddenly make every bulletin sound trustworthy, but it did show that this was now a national trial of confidence, not only a local emergency. America was watching. And because America was watching, the meaning of every official word became even more important. It is easy to describe this part only as politics, but that would miss its emotional truth. People wanted to see whether power itself looked afraid. Did leaders sound steady? Did they sound evasive? Did they seem to understand what local families were feeling? In a technological crisis, public confidence often depends not only on technical facts, but on whether the people speaking those facts appear morally present. That is part of why Carter's visit mattered so much. It also mattered because television carried the crisis into living rooms far from Pennsylvania. A family in another state could watch the story and imagine the same thing happening near them. 3 Mile Island became national not only because it was important, but because it was understandable in one fearful sentence. Something has gone wrong at a nuclear plant, and the people in charge are still trying to explain how bad it is. That sentence did not require advanced science. It required only one thing: the knowledge that modern life depends on systems most people cannot see inside. Chapter 7. The Years After the Headlines. After the most frightening days passed, the long part of the story began. There had been a partial meltdown. That fact alone guaranteed that the accident would not remain just a rumor, a scare, or a political slogan. The damage inside Unit 2 was real. Now the country had to face what cleanup, investigation, and memory would look like. Cleanup would take years. The damaged fuel had to be managed. Contaminated water had to be handled. Workers had to enter difficult spaces carefully and repeatedly. The accident did not end when the television story cooled down. It settled into a slower life. Reports, tests, repairs, meetings, arguments. Men and women in protective gear did work that was careful, slow, and often invisible to the public. This is another part of industrial disaster that the public often sees only dimly. The frightening day ends. The difficult years begin. For local residents, that long aftermath had its own weight. Official studies later found that the small releases from the accident caused no detectable health effects in workers or in the public around the plant. That official conclusion matters. It belongs in the story, clearly. But another fact belongs there too. People had lived through fear before those studies existed. They had listened to uncertain bulletins. They had watched children leave. They had seen the language of authority strain under pressure. A later report can settle many scientific questions. It cannot completely settle the emotional history of those days. In towns near the plant, memory did not move at the speed of official findings. Some people accepted the later conclusions with relief. Some accepted them only partly. Some never felt completely at peace again when they heard the words nuclear accident. The long cleanup also had a symbolic effect. Every year that work continued, it reminded the public that the event had not been a passing misunderstanding. Something inside the reactor had truly broken. Something had to be carried out, cleaned, measured, and watched over. That slow labor gave the story a second body. The first body was fear. The second body was cleanup. That is why 3 Mile Island left two kinds of damage: physical damage inside the reactor and damage to public trust outside it. For some residents, that second damage lasted longer than the first. A reactor can be shut down, a building can be cleaned, a report can be printed, but trust does not move in such a straight line. Once a person has spent days wondering whether a child is safe from something invisible, later calm can feel thinner than it once did. That does not mean science did not matter. It did. Official measurement mattered. Dose estimates mattered. Long-term study mattered. But human memory follows a different clock. People remember what they felt while waiting, while packing, while deciding. That memory became part of the local inheritance of the accident. It also became part of family history. Parents told children where they had been when the radio stayed on all day. Children remembered the strange mood in the house even if they did not yet understand the word radiation. Some memories stayed in very small forms: a radio that stayed on all afternoon, a bag that was packed near the door, a parent speaking in a lower voice than usual, a road that seemed busier than normal. History often survives in those details, not only in reports, but in the atmosphere people remember from one difficult week. For some families, the story was later told at dinner tables in simple words. We did not know what to trust. We stayed. We left. We waited. We listened. That plain family language carried the event forward just as surely as official history did. It is part of why the accident stayed alive. It was not only stored in documents, it was stored in memory, retelling, and the changed feeling people carried when they heard the words nuclear plant. That feeling outlasted the headlines. It stayed in the region for years. Chapter 8: How America Changed Its Voice. 3 Mile Island did not end nuclear power in the United States, but it changed how Americans talked about it. Regulators looked harder at emergency planning. Training became more serious. human factors gained more attention. Control room design, warning systems, and communication procedures all came under deeper judgment. Those changes were practical. They mattered. But there was also a wider public change. You can hear that change in the history that followed. Arguments about regulation became sharper. Arguments about emergency planning became more serious. Arguments about what experts owe the public became harder to avoid. 3 Mile Island did not create all those arguments by itself, but it gave them a powerful, unforgettable scene. It also gave the nuclear industry a permanent mirror. Whenever officials later spoke about safety culture, emergency drills, operator training, public communication, or control room design, the shadow of 3 Mile Island stood nearby. The accident had become more than one event. It had become a reference point, an example, a warning. Whenever nuclear energy returned to headlines, 3 Mile Island returned with it. That did not mean Americans suddenly agreed about nuclear power, far from it. But disagreement itself had changed. After March 1979, people were no longer arguing only in theory. They were arguing after a real American accident had already shaken the country. That changed the emotional weight of later debate. A supporter of nuclear power now had to answer public fear more directly. A critic of nuclear power now had a real American example close at hand. Reporters had a reference point. Politicians had a reference point. Ordinary voters had one too. 3 Mile Island did not settle the argument. It made the argument harder, sharper, and more personal. Chapter 9. What Remained on the Island. When Americans remember 3 Mile Island, they often remember argument. Was the danger overstated? Was it understated? Was nuclear power unfairly wounded, or had the country only barely understood how close it came to a larger disaster? Those arguments are part of the history, but underneath them is a simpler memory. A plant before dawn, a control room full of alarms, a valve that should have closed and did not, a family trying to decide whether to put a child in the car, a state government choosing the words pregnant women and preschool children, a country learning that modern fear can arrive without flame, without collapse, without anything dramatic in the sky. That is why 3 Mile Island still matters. It was not the worst nuclear disaster in history, but it became one of the clearest stories about how fear can spread when danger is hard to see and hard to explain. The accident taught many Americans that safety is not only about machines, it is also about what people are told while they are afraid. The island itself stayed in place. The river kept moving around it, but in the American imagination, the site had changed. It was no longer only a place of modern power. It had become a place where confidence failed in public view. Epilogue. The river still moves around the island. The worst hours of March 1979 are long gone. But one thing stayed behind. Not smoke, not ruins, distrust. That was the long shadow of 3 Mile Island.